51 years ago this month, Hurricane Agnes made landfall along Florida's panhandle before moving up the East Coast. As it reached Pennsylvania, Agnes collided with a cold front, causing heavy rainfall for several days. This resulted in widespread flooding in many areas, particularly along the Susquehanna River and its tributaries. The floodwater overwhelmed riverbanks, submerging towns, destroying infrastructure, and displacing thousands of people. Dennis Frizzy was 11 years old at the time, but clearly remembers the day he had to flee his home on Hoke Island in the Susquehanna River.
There was so much debris floating down the river, we couldn't get off. So thank God we had the telephone lines, and they came and picked us up in the helicopters. I say my mom was 5 months pregnant with my little brother Bobby, and like I said, with 19 of us came walking across that bridge, and we were the last ones before they closed it down. It took years to get rid of that smell. I mean, even when it rained years later, you could smell. I'll never forget that smell.
Rivers are incredible forces of nature, powerful, awe-inspiring, but when they flood, they can pose a serious risk to the people who call the riverbanks home. What can make it even more dangerous is the confusion about how river levels are monitored and what a river stage actually is. Today we are going off the radar and into the world of river flood forecasting. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Rivers around the country are constantly being monitored with gauges. The term stream gauging, it's used to mean measurement of flow as well as river water level. The gauges are at a fixed point, but they differ in level depending on the river location where they're installed. It can make it a bit confusing when you hear a TV meteorologist talk about river heights.
The Big Sioux River at Akron and Hawarden is expected to crest just below 18 feet, which is moderate flood stage. Later this week, currently, the river sits at about 13 feet. Flood stage begins at about 16 feet.
In today's episode, we're going to explain river forecasting. My colleague at the National Weather Desk, Matt Ritter, brought up this idea, so, of course, I had to bring him into the discussion. Matt's a fellow meteorologist and worked in television in Pennsylvania for many years, so he brought some really great insight into the problems that folks on the rivers experience. We'll also have David Ondrejik join the conversation. David's a hydrologist at the Middle Atlantic River Forecast Center. He's going to help clear up the river stage confusion and tell us about some new technology in river flood forecasting that will certainly save lives. And then later, we'll hear from Dr. Jeremy Porter from the First Street Foundation. They just released a report this week showing that flood standards that NOAA's been using for years may be outdated. They've created some new precipitation modeling that shows some parts of the country are prone to get a 100-year flood, more like every 8 years. So sit back, get ready to learn, and enjoy a deep dive into the world of river flooding. David, and I want to also introduce people to Matt Ritter, who also works for the National Weather Desk and is a former broadcast meteorologist as well. We're both recovering broadcast meteorologists and enjoying this side of things very much. Right, Matt?
Oh, I still get to fill in every now and then, but generally speaking, yeah.
So your toes are wet, but you're not in the deep end.
You can never leave.
It's in your blood, right?
Yeah.
So you brought up this topic, Matt, of river flooding, which initially I was like, it was,
well,
I was like, I don't know. But then you explained, and the more you talked about it, the more I realized how much I don't know about river stages.
Yes. Yeah. A lot of folks hear the term river stages, and it means a lot to people who have direct interest, people who have businesses, people who live right along rivers and streams. And it can be a confusing topic to people who are directly affected by these waterways, but there's a lot of confusion about what exactly they are and what their relevance is, what they mean. But even worse, I've heard some people in our field directly get the terms wrong sometimes. So I figured, why not use this podcast as a perfect platform to consult with an expert to finally get it out there. What do these things mean? What the relevance is, and how things could change in the future.
Yeah. So David, give us a little background on where you work, because you work for the National Weather Service, but it's kind of a subset of that, correct?
Right. So I work for the National Weather Service, and I'm stationed at the Middle Atlantic River Forecast Center in State College, Pennsylvania. And so you're probably more familiar with the local National Weather Service office. There's 122 of those across the United States, and they cover an area about as far as a radar can see. And we cover a much bigger area at the River Forecast Centers. There's only 13 of those in the nation. And so we cover major river basins. So for example, ours in State College, we cover major river basins like the Susquehanna River Basin, the Delaware River Basin, the Raritan, the Passaic, the Potomac, the James and the Appomattox River Basins. So we're much bigger. And even though we're bigger, we encompass 7 National Weather Service offices. But we are the smallest of all the river forecast centers across the nation.
Oh, interesting.
And
What do you mean by small? Like just less people work there?
Yeah. So like there are some that are 10 times bigger than us. The Northeast River Forecast Center is slightly bigger than us, but some like the Missouri River Basin, they go from parts of the Northwest United States all the way to the Ohio River. So yeah, they're much, much bigger in area.
And you're exclusively focused on the waterways, hydrology concerns.
Yeah, hydrology, and so not only we do flooding, but we calculate a lot of the data for the drought, which is what's kind of going on right now. So like when you see drought departures, when a county says we're 7 inches below normal for the last 90 days, that's kind of where they're getting the data from.
Okay, so you're involved with like fire weather forecasting, which is funny to think of given the...
Yeah, I think it's, we don't do the fire weather forecasting per se, but I think it's shown that it's drive through the data.
Right, so the elements are going into that.
Correct.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how you monitor the rivers. Can you tell people when we say certain stages, what is a river stage?
Yeah. So a river stage is we're just measuring how much water is in the river from, this is where it kind of gets confusing, an arbitrary point. They're not related to sea level. It's kind of an arbitrary point. And so, some may say that you're saying there's only 40 feet of water in the river at point A and only 20 feet of water in the river at point B. And it's kind of arbitrary. So you kind of got to get that out of your head.
Right. And to not to lead your comment, but a lot of folks, including some meteorologists, think a river stage is a river depth. And that's not necessarily true.
That's
right?
Absolutely right. That's a great way of explaining it. It's not the depth of the river, because you could have a river stage of 17 feet, but there's only 4 feet of water in the in the river.
Yeah, it took me a long time to finally get that. I don't remember learning it in school. I don't think I had to take that course.
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The arbitrary part is kind of a hard concept to get by.
When a river or a stream is at a certain stage, we know from history, right, that has an impact on the shoreline.
Right. And so, so they measure up from that arbitrary point, and we know when we get up to a certain level from that point is when we start seeing impacts on people, whether it's, a field being flooded or somebody's house getting water in their basement or a road being closed, things like that.
Right. And so one must wonder a little bit, is it even a flood unless there are buildings and structures and roads or people in the way? That's by definition, that is our definition. Unless there's an impact to someone, some structure, it's not considered a flood.
So the general public should not pay attention to numbers. They should pay attention to advisories, watches, warnings.
Well, they should pay attention to both. Most people who live by a river know the level of the water that impacts them, unless they've just moved there. And so, there are times when I first moved here as a hydrologist, I went out and I met with people, and they taught me, the people that have lived there for a long time. They could tell me. I remember people taking me to their barns and saying, this is the level where Agnes reached, and this is the level where, January 96 reached. And, they taught me what impacted their particular place.
I know from experience, I used to live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. One of my favorite taverns when I visit friends at home still has a mark of where the Conestoga River flooded during Agnes, which is considered the flood of record in the good old 717. And I forget, what was it, last year or the year before, we were going to have the worst possible flooding since Agnes. And I remember the reference point, and I got a hold of all my friends. I got a hold of my friend who owns that particular tavern, and I said, hey, get your electronics out of the basement, get it in the attic. This could be one of the worst things you've ever seen. And that's what happened.
That was Ida.
Thank you. I knew it was an ice storm, one of those ice storms.
So I'm curious about the gauges themselves. Are you guys in charge of setting those up? And who does that, and how is it decided where they go?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we could not do what we do without the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey. They put out all the gauges, they maintain them, and they're fabulous. I mean, I couldn't say enough good things about them. And it's a lot of hard work. I mean, installing these gauges, if you ever drive across the bridge and you see a little house on the side of the bridge, it looks like a little porta potty. And that's the gauge house. And it holds the equipment inside of it. And so what they have to do is they have to dig down from that spot down to the water level. And then they go down beneath the water level. And then they run pipes out into the water to let the water filter into that protected area above the gauge house. And then they house the equipment up in the house. And they have a variety of different gauges. They have a float gauge that they run a wire down, and they put like an upside down pie plate in there, and it floats up and down. It's on a pulley system, and it's got a counterweight. And when the water goes out, up the pie plate raises, and the counterweight goes down, and they can measure the length of the wire, and they can convert that into a number. And it's got a satellite linked to it. And once an hour, it'll send that number up to the satellite. The satellite takes it and relays it to our receiving station in Wallops Island. And then from Wallops Island, it comes to our office.
Is that like a more updated version? Is that new technology?
We've been doing it this way for 30 years.
Oh.
And it's a very short, we only need a burst. They're assigned a minute or two window that they send their data to. Because there's thousands and thousands of these across the country. So they have an assigned time frame that they send their data to. And so it's a very well-oiled machine. And they don't need much satellite time to do this. So that's one type of gauge. So you've probably seen the other types of gauges. The old ones are just lines painted on a bridge. Those are called staff gauges. And the most recent kind they have are pressure transducers or bubbler gauges. And these, they run a pipe out into a hose out into the water, and they send a bubble of air out there, and they can measure the pressure it takes to send that bubble out there. And they can convert that to how much water is there, how much pressure it takes to send that water out. They can calculate how high the water is above that, which is really neat. It's pretty amazing. And they convert the height to that.
Are all of the technologies in the river? Are there any technologies being worked on that are like remote sensing?
There are a couple. They have a Doppler measurement. And it sits up on the bridge, and it measures the time it takes for the Doppler pulse to hit the water and bounce back.
Is there any that are better?
I think they're just as accurate, but they're pretty expensive.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So these other ones have been, tested over decades, and they're pretty easy to maintain. They're good at it. So I think that's probably why they're still out there.
You mentioned Agnes. I'm curious about the coastal aspect of things and tidal flooding, and if you have relationships and work closely with the tidal flood people.
Yeah.
Because it is where I live in Charleston, South Carolina, you can look at river flooding, but it's so tidal dependent.
For our office in 2012, we started picking up a few tidal forecast points, and it gets pretty tricky with the tides, and freshwater impacts. So we have to create a new hydraulic model to do this, and so it's very tricky. We have 5 points that we forecast tidal in. Our total number of points is 175 that we forecast for every day, and 5 of those are tidal points. 3 of them are in the DC area. We have 1 in the James River and 1 up near Philadelphia. And we forecast those hourly compared to our normal forecast where every 6 hours. So it's a little different.
Dave, I think that the hydro models, the ones that you use to put out your river flood warnings and advisories, I think they're excellent. I mean, obviously they're not as good as predicting the future, but I think they provide tremendously accurate guidance in terms of being able to prepare folks. I was wondering how do you think the freshwater is handled versus the tidal water? Of course, here in my market, we have both. I have the tidal Potomac, and I have the last freshwater one at Georgetown.
Okay. Yeah. So the tides, we're pretty good at. We know the tide cycle. We can predict that for hundreds of years in the future if we wanted to. It's the freshwater has a big impact, but also, a big system, if we get a big blowout tide, we're not quite as good experienced forecasting how much can blow out or how much can blow in. And that's just years of experience. And when I say we're not that experienced, we may be off by a foot or two because of those things. And, when we're talking about, the magnitude of those, that's a small magnitude, but we're getting better.
And then being able to put that into the equation.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Once we get more experience, we fix the math.
So how long do you often see impacts of river flooding post an event?
So it depends upon the basin you're in. So first, the Susquehanna Basin, you can have things happen in the northern part of the basin, and 3-4 days it's out the southern end. But then there's other basins where it takes a week or more.
Sounds like eating a sandwich.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's different for every basin.
Yeah, we had the historic flooding in 2015, I want to say, down here. And it was weeks and weeks. Like the Edisto River was a huge problem 3-4 weeks later.
Yeah. And that also depends upon the duration of the rain. If you have, 5-10 days of historic rain, it's going to take much longer for it to work its way through the system, especially if you have the tides clogging it,
right,
and it out.
Has climate change made a difference in the gauges? Have they had to be moved because of excessively high water or low water?
That's a good question. I don't know offhand any gauges that have had to been, at least none come to mind right now. But you got to remember when the USGS installs these gauges, they install them so they are above the record floods. They harden these gauges to make sure that they can handle what the record flood has been and then some. And so these gauges for much of our area have been installed to handle things like Agnes and January 96 and the 1936 flood. So they were set. We have a high bar that has already been set.
For folks at home who may not know, January 1996, are you referencing the famous ice jam on the Susquehanna?
Yes.
We had a flash flood in Harrisburg on the Susquehanna River because of an ice jam that broke.
Correct.
Took out half of the Market Street Bridge.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. And then, there are stories and fact, my dad lives in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and he talks about they went to bed with 30 inches of snow and woke up and there was none. It's just incredible amounts of water that went into the rivers in a short amount of time.
Do you have any advice for broadcasters or really any meteorologists that are sharing information with the public, how to effectively communicate river flood hazards?
Everything I see, and I watch the TV meteorologist because, it's just a habit, and it's something that I really enjoy. But I just love the way you talk about weather safety and flood safety. Like, the trying to get the point across to people that driving through flooded roadways is not the thing to do. And we still struggle with that today. In the last 50, 60, 70 years, put somebody on the moon and brought them back safely. And we split the atom and we splice the gene and we have all these great things, but we still have trouble stopping people from driving through flooded roadways.
That is so very true, but we can never stop sending that message. We can never stop sending that message. Yeah. I will say in some defense, there have been some occasions where we've had some flash flooding here in the DC area where people didn't drive into the flood waters. They were just sitting there in rush hour traffic.
Is that right?
And it came up to them.
Came to them. Yeah.
Yeah. That is, so that does happen too.
I think that happened a little bit in Ida, in like the Philadelphia and New York City, that kind of happened to some people there,
right? And that's a storm drainage argument as much as it is. Right.
If you go back and look at the statistics, I think if I remember the ones from 2021, I think there were 146 flood deaths that year, and Ida had a big impact there. And I think over half of those were people from driving into flooded roadways. And that's higher than our normal. I think our 10-year average ending in 2021 was 98, and the 30-year average might have been in the upper 80s. But like the flood safety thing that our partners in the media help us with, we can reach a lot of people, but you just have thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people listening to you. So we can't thank you enough for the help you give us.
Well, I think the Weather Service did a great thing with Turn Around, Don't Drown, too, because, it just rolls off the tongue and everybody uses it, and everybody at first sounded silly saying it, but nobody forgets that.
Yeah.
And the same thing with When the Thunder Roars, Go Indoors. Like, those are two things my kids know. So and remember.
And I think the language of flash flood emergencies have given us in the media a little extra muscle,
right,
to deliver that. When you're not just talking about water over a roadway or heading towards your house or camper or whatever, you have basically a stream on land coming right at you, flowing water. Seriously life-threatening stuff.
Right. It's rare that you have that wall of water coming at you, but when you do, now we have something to tell you, to alert you to this is the one.
And in these days of social media, we can share reputable, reliable videos of the phenomenon taking place.
Yeah.
Speaking of graphics and whatnot, and in these days of GIS, geographical information systems, you talked about it a little bit before the interview. We now have access to what are called inundation maps.
Correct.
This is a tremendous tool when it comes to referencing past flooding impacts based on forecasts. Tell us a little bit more about these inundation maps and how people at home may start, they'll start seeing them on air and online and in their apps.
Yeah. So right now we have a handful of points across the nation, and many of them are in the mid-Atlantic, where we have static maps that'll tell you how high the water will get based on our flood forecast. And those are at specific points, and they're only for a narrow section upstream and downstream of that point. But we're getting into a more robust system, and it's going to be rolled out here in the fall. And it's eventually go nationwide, but it's starting in a couple of small locations. And one of those locations is the Susquehanna Basin up here in Pennsylvania. And it's not only going to be for those specific points, but it's going to be for all the small little streams. And we're going to take some computer model data that shows you how much rain is going to fall and run that through some applications and be able to create maps that'll tell you that the water's going to get up and get to, house A on Main Street, but not house B on Main Street. And that's going to be something that has never been done before.
That's amazing.
Real time. Yeah. And as you can imagine, it takes a lot of computer power to produce this. It takes a lot of input data. And so, there's a lot of chance for error, and we're working on lowering that bad data. But the results that we're seeing are exciting. And we're as good as our last forecast.
Yeah.
And so we have to put out good
Very much
quality data. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're striving.
I think in a flash flood, someone at point B seeing the house on point A wash away. Yeah. I think they'll appreciate getting the heads up that they were close enough.
They were close enough, right? Yeah, yeah. And you have to use some logic. You're that close. You have to be. Right.
And as warnings in general and all types of weather get better and better and smaller, I think people are taking them a lot more seriously.
Yeah, and it makes a good point. We used to warn for county level, even if it was in the smallest part of the south, the southeast part of the county. Everybody in the county got warned.
I remember.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
People are like, "What is this warning? I don't want to anywhere near there."
Well, and that's one reason another reason I wanted to be part of this podcast, and was part of my idea. Right. Even river and stream flood warnings used to be at the county level, and so they didn't affect a lot of people. But now in these days of apps, some folks who don't live on the river and the stream are getting bulletins on their phone. So even though it may not directly impact them, maybe now they'll know what that bulletin meant before they delete it. They'll know what it meant.
And if they're driving that way to work or whatever, at least they have a heads up that something's down there.
And that's the great thing about the bulletins is it'll say like the 200 block of Stick Lane is going to be inundated with water at this time.
We're trying.
Well, thank you for all you do, David. Matt, do you have anything else you want to toss in?
Oh no, just I'm a big fan of the River Forecast Centers. I don't think
you have a fan club, David. Did you know that?
Well, that's one.
I remembered your name, but I do think the River Forecast Centers across the country do a tremendous job. It's definitely a job that broadcast meteorologists don't have the time to do themselves. But yeah, I'm at a loss for words right now, and maybe I'm a little starstruck.
It's a great feeling for us when we see our data on TV, and know that it's another avenue to get to the people that need it.
Well, it's going to be even more rewarding to know that you saved someone's life too. I mean,
that, and just the story you told about your friends in Lancaster. I kind of got a little bit of a chill that they saved all their electronics because you gave them a call and they knew that their basement might get flooded. That kind of stuff hits home. So I appreciate that.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks for all that you do, and all your colleagues and everyone else in all the other river forecast centers across the country.
Keep us updated on those inundation maps. We can't wait to see them. First Street Foundation is a nonprofit that's been doing extensive research into climate modeling and working to find ways to make climate risk factors understandable to individuals, governments, and industries. They just released a report on their new precipitation model this week, and the results are a bit alarming. So basically, the gold standard for flood expectations right now is NOAA's Atlas 14. So when you hear people talk about a 100-year flood, it comes from that Atlas 14 data. They're working on updating this. In fact, Atlas 15 is in the works right now, but it could be years before it comes out. Here's Dr. Jeremy Porter from First Street.
But the problem with the way that the NOAA Atlas 14 estimates were computed is that it's actually not taking climate change into account. So the estimates are reverting back to a median, which in lots of times is like a 1980s or 1970s climate versus the climate that we're living in today. And a 1 in 100-year depth in the NOAA Atlas 14 is actually maybe a 1 in 20-year depth or a 1 in 50-year depth. And one of the biggest findings from our report was that over half the population in the U.S., about 51% of the population, lives in a county where NOAA Atlas's 1 in 100-year depth is actually a 1 in 50-year event. So their 1 in 100-year storm is likely to occur twice as often as they expect.
Now, we reached out to NOAA for comment, and while they told us they don't comment on other organizations' research or products, they did send us a statement. In calling the Atlas process the authoritative and national standard, NOAA wrote, "The Atlas methodology undergoes a rigorous peer review process and employs broad stakeholder engagement to ensure that those who use Atlas are involved in producing it and are confident in the outcomes." If you want to check out your flood risk, First Street Foundation has a pretty cool website called riskfactor.com. You can put in your address and it'll pull up maps showing you what your risk of not only flooding is, but all climate change impacts like wind and wildfire. Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes publish every Tuesday. If you have a weather nerd in your life or you know someone that could be impacted by river flooding, please share this episode with them. We'd also love you to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Let us know what you think of the show. Give me some ideas for future episodes. This podcast is produced, hosted, and edited by me. Special thanks to Eric Newell and Ryan Berlin for their help, and of course to Matt Ritter for co-hosting the episode with me. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.
NOAA, they have the funding. Like a lot of government agencies, there's a tremendous amount of bureaucracy. It's really no fault of NOAA. NOAA has all of these steps that they're mandated to go through to get approval on their different precipitation records. They have to work with communities. They have to work with scientists. They have to work with a lot of different constituents to be able to actually produce these records. We would produce something that we think is pretty similar to what Atlas 15 is going to look like, but we don't have all of those requirements or hurdles that we have to clear. So we expect that what we're putting out now is what NOAA Atlas 15 is going to look like, or something very similar to that.